Dear colleagues, before we begin to tell you about features of the antiquarian book trade in modern Russia, let me say a few words about this trade development during the preceding period. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the antiquarian book trade in Russia, in general, was developing in the same way as well as in Europe and America, perhaps only at a slower pace. Major changes in book trade took place during the Soviet period, which lasted from October 1917 until the early 90s. Starting from the 1930s, antique sales and auctions were prohibited. The antiquarian book trade was largely refocused on second-hand book trade. Uniform prices on old books were introduced all over the country, and selling books at any other price became a criminal offense. A lot of books were outlawed altogether due to ideological bias. Among them were all liturgical publications, books and magazines of the early 20th century, primarily those pertaining to the symbolist and aesthetic movements and works of philosophers and artists who left the country in the first post-revolution era or were affiliated with foreign art groups. During the Soviet period, new names were constantly added to the forbidden books list. For example, Solzhenitsyn, who was also exiled from the country. Exporting books from Russia and importing them into the country was prohibited as well, especially books in foreign languages. However, the government was actively supporting second-hand book trade, considering this to be an alternative approach to satisfy the population's demand for books. The situation began to change during the Perestroika period in the late 1980s and in the beginning of the 90s. Now, I won't go into detail regarding the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and how hard it was to transit from command economy to the market relations in Russia. The main idea here is, since that period, the new era of antiquarian book trade has begun. So now I'll tell you about the main trends of the modern antiquarian book market in Russia. Nowadays, there is a lack of reliable statistics in the book trade industry. One thing is certain, over 90% of the trade is concentrated in Moscow. There are 5 main enterprises conducting trade of antique books. These include traditional second-hand bookstores, larger and newer bookstores which include specialized section of second-hand books, antiquarian shops, salons, and galleries in which there are other antiques aside from books such as painting, jewelry, porcelain, religious icons, etc. And also there are auction houses, online shops, and internet portals. Aside from stores, there are other ways of selling old books as well, which include book markets and markets of various goods, stationary and non-stationary, located both indoors and on city streets. The Antiquarian Book Fair, which takes place as part of a non-fiction book fair, and the Russian Antique Salon. In the past 3 years, antiquarian books are also sold as a part of book fairs. For example, the Red Square. There are almost no antiquarian bookstores specializing in one particular theme or period. Most of them trade books of different types, themes, and time periods. The purchase and sale of goods is carried out on a commission basis. At the moment, auctions and online resale are the most popular forms of antique book trade in Russia, as well as in many other countries. In comparison with American, English, and European continental auctions, Russian national auction trade is fairly new, and it is a generalized experience of Western countries adapted by Russian market participants. It was that method which made Russian antiquarian book market more transparent than it was only 10 years ago. Today, however, Russian auction trade is quite different from Western auctions. Its biggest difference is perhaps the lower rate that is charged from both sides, usually ranging from 10 to 20%. The number of auction houses and independently hosted auctions is growing every year in Russia. In 2010, 59 auctions took place in Moscow, and in 2013, there were already almost 100 auctions. Today, there are up to 180 auctions per year in the capital, which means 10 to 15 book auctions per month without a summer break. Nowadays, there are 20 auction houses trading old books, including 19 houses in Moscow and 1 house in St. Petersburg, which trades online only. All the national auctions are universal both in time of book publication and in topics. They have been expanding their range through manuscripts, photographs, posters, newspapers, flyers, stocks, and etc. in recent years. During the last 4 years, the leader in auction selling has been Litfund. The auction house was founded in 2015 and now has a market share of 50% in Russia. This house has held more than 170 auctions by now. The auction house has gradually expanded its range. Having started in strictly book-oriented trade, they now deal with paintings and contemporary art as well. Sergei Burmistrov, the head of the auction house, has dedicated his career to bring new ideas to their auction house, which their competitors have never had. Litfund holds auctions in St. Petersburg and London and arranges charity auctions together with various organizations. It has been publishing its digest in print and digital. In 2018, the auction house released the publication called 100 of the most expensive books and autographs in Russia, which is of great interest to antique dealers and collectors. Among other large auction houses in Russia are House of Antiquarian Book on Nikitskom, Antiquarium, Empire, 12th Chair. Every large auction house releases well-prepared auction catalogs. Nowadays, all participants of the Russian auction trade are presented on the online platform bidspirit.com, which has both Russian and English interfaces. Its charges are quite low compared to the prices of other well-known portals such as Invaluable and Live Auctioneers. In fact, Bidspirit has become somewhat of a basic guide to domestic prices of Russian antiquarian books. New booksellers usually set the price with a view to this guide, as well as beginner collectors who have only recently begun to gather their home libraries. Unfortunately, foreign colleagues and collectors know almost nothing about this portal, although some of them list their books there. For the last 20 years, national internet trade has been constantly growing. Today, we can highlight 5 main groups of internet websites in which Russian book trade takes place. First of all, these are so-called classic internet stores. By today, there are 20 similar enterprises which are universal by their range and specialization. Ozon.ru is the largest universal store, which sells a huge number of different types of goods, from food to furniture to electronics, including old books, which exceed 100,000 items. Other large online stores which have proven themselves on the market are Biblion and Bookvitsa. They also have been actively working offline for the past few years. The second group of internet enterprises are internet portals, which are platforms for sellers and second-hand book buyers. The largest of them is ILAB.ru, established in 1999, which has sold more than 4 million copies of the most diverse print products of all time. These are books, maps, postcards, posters, and many others. It's important to highlight that ILAB is used not only by individuals and dealers, but by stores and auction houses as well. The third group is represented by online auction platforms, which appeared in Russia in 1999. Currently, we do not have regular online auction platforms in our country, specializing only in trading old books. But we do have universal auction platforms that sell various goods, including old books. These are auction.ru, meshok.ru, auckland.ru, antiquariat.ru, and others. The fourth group is represented by sites of the antiquarian bookshops. In Russia, these sites are basically online business cards with enterprises' contacts, their location, specialization. Sometimes you can even buy books here as you would in a classic online store. For example, the website of the large antiquarian store, Russian Bibliophile. Finally, the last group is comprised of websites of dealers and collectors. Over the years, the number of such sites has been decreasing in Russia because most of the dealers prefer to sell their books on the aforementioned alip.ru. Now let's talk about antiquarian book buyers in Russia. Unfortunately, the number of regular customers in antiquarian books in Russia is not large, according to antiquarian market experts. The number of regular customers range from 2,000 to 5,000 people. We can divide them into 5 main categories. The first group of buyers consists of those who spend more than $100,000 on their hobby annually. Unsurprisingly, it is the smallest group. There are about 100 people in it. The second group is 5 times larger than the first one. It is comprised of about 500 collectors. They invest in antiquarian books from $10,000 to $100,000 per year. The third group, which has several thousand collectors, spends up to $10,000 in antiquarian books annually. The fourth group is represented not by collectors, but by specialists such as doctors, scientists, and teachers, who collect books in accordance with their main activity. It is quite difficult to calculate the number of these people. The fifth group of buyers is the largest. They are random people who purchase old books as gifts. The price range of this type of purchase is usually very narrow, up to $200 if the gift is for a family member and up to $1,000 if it's corporate. It's important to know that since the 2000s, the portrait of the buyer has changed drastically. If earlier it consisted mainly of professors and intellectuals, today it's primarily young and middle-aged politicians and businessmen who desire to create a home or corporate collection of antiquarian books. We should also mention what is in demand and is bought on the Russian antique market today. Over the past few years, there have been major changes in consumer demand for antiquarian books. The interest in gift books of the 19th and early 20th centuries, luxurious editions of books dedicated to the imperial theme, and other similar books of this period has practically decreased. At the same time, demand remains for the following books. Books of the first Russian printer Ivan Fedorov and his students. Books of the first quarter of the 18th century, printed during the reign of Peter the Great. First editions of the Golden Age classics of Russian literature, primarily Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Dostoevsky. Books that were printed or preserved in small number of copies. Books of the late 17th to 18th centuries regarding travel and history containing maps and prints. In recent years, there has been an increase in demand for the books of the 20th century in Russia. Rare books of the Silver Age are very popular, especially the first editions of Tsvetaeva, Akhmatova, Gumileva, and others. There is also interest in books of the Russian avant-garde, both pre-revolutionary and those published in the first years of the Soviet Union, for example, books of Mayakovsky, Goncharov, Khrushchev. Then there are great Stalinist photographic books, which are also in great demand. Fundamental large format publications appeared in small runs in the 1930s. Such masters as Rodchenko, Stepanova, Lisitsky, and others designed them. Demand for antiquarian books is growing, becoming more special and narrowly targeted. For example, there is growing interest in publication devoted to history of astronautics, fashion, railway, banking, cooking, etc. Catalogs of different products, restaurant menus, bookmarks are in demand as well. Russian collectors have also shown a great interest in autographs, not only in autographs of poets and writers, but also of politicians, figures of the national culture, art, and others, including the lesser-known figures. They are widely put up and sold at the auctions. It must be pointed out that in the past few years, the attitude of bibliophiles and antique dealers toward the provenance of the national book has changed dramatically. Thanks to the modern historical conditions, it became possible to follow the existence history of the exact copy of the book. Unfortunately, antiquarian books published in European languages are in very little demand on the Russian market. Moreover, books in rarer foreign languages are almost impossible to sell in Russia, and there are several reasons for that. Firstly, during the Soviet period, the country was heavily closed off, and secondly, a huge portion of the Russian population simply does not know these foreign languages, for example, Latin, Greek, or Arabic. A few words about restoration of the antiquarian books in Russia. Today, professional restoration work is carried out by public or private workshops, the number of which reaches up to 20 in Moscow, with 10 workshops in each group. The largest and most popular state-owned enterprises are the Workshop of Russian State Library, the largest national book depository, the Grabari Art Conservation Center, and the Central Universal Science Library of Nekrasov. The largest private companies are, for example, Bookbinding Workshop of Books and Manuscripts, Raritet, Workshops, Vash Restaurator, and Paragon. Public and private workshops have their own advantages and disadvantages, and their own clients. For example, private companies offer their services at lower prices than the public ones, use various materials, including those of foreign manufacture, and offer relatively short periods of restoration works. Public workshops, on the other hand, have improved technological basis for book restoration and perform work according to a stricter standard. Their main disadvantages are high prices and lack of modern material. Moreover, their work can usually take up to a year and more. It's important to note that in general, the market of restoration equipment and materials in Russia is very small. Nowadays, there is almost no local production of the modern materials, and only few companies import these materials to Russia. That leads to high prices and very poor range of materials. Unfortunately, most of the national restores are unaware of how highly developed the materials and equipment markets are in other countries. This problem has yet to be solved. Starting with the middle of the 1970s, Moscow State University of Printing Arts trains specialists in book trade and provides support to the antiquarian industry in Russia. The same university also carried out advanced training for antiquarian dealers who already worked in the industry. In fact, it was the only scientific and methodological center in Russia that developed theories and methods of the antiquarian book trade. The university also prepared the first Russian textbooks, second-hand book trade and antiquarian book, and other training manuals for antique dealers and collectors. With the support of the ILAB University, it created internship programs in America, Europe, and Australia. Nowadays, former students of University of Printing Arts hold positions in large auction houses and in other companies related to the antiquarian business. Unfortunately, university no longer accepts new students for the antiquarian book specialization, and only current students will be able to finish their education. The new administration of the university is no longer interested in providing education in the antiquarian sector. Sadly, it will lead to severe consequences for this industry. Apparently, Guild of Antiquarian Booksellers will have to be the one to find a solution to this problem. As you know, Guild of Antiquarian Booksellers was founded in Moscow in 2012 with the support of the ILAB. Nowadays, it is the first and the only association of this type in Russia. The founders of the guild are 7 following enterprises: Moscow State University of Printing Arts, 3 largest Russian bookshops including Biblioglobus Moskva and Moskovsky Dom Knigi, the largest auction house at that time, House of Antiquarian Book in Nikitskom, the Antiquarian Salon among collectors, and online store Biblion. The guild has been a full member of the ILAB since 2012. Certainly, the number is not as big in comparison with the number of members in other associations of the ILAB, but we should remember what a hard path the antiquarian book trade had during the Soviet period. Unfortunately, many Russian antiquarians of the venerable age still do not trust the government. As a result, large collectors of antiquarian books do not want to make their collections public and purchase at auctions. There are also many issues relating to the import and export of antiquarian books. Nevertheless, members of the guild work hard to increase the interest in collecting and trading of the antiquarian books. They take part in various international fairs and exhibitions in order to broaden their contracts, find new buyers and sellers of the antiquarian books, some of whom you know very well, Catherine Cousteau and Pavel Chepezhov. In conclusion, we'd like to say a few words about the challenges of our industry. First of all is the problem of attracting new members in the guild and increasing its influence on the development of the antiquarian book trade in Russia. Next is the question of human resources, which has recently become a big issue. There is a need to build a new system of training and retraining system of personnel. We hope that now you have some understanding of how the antiquarian book trade has been developing in Russia. Thank you for your attention. We are now ready to answer your questions.